of disability and armed conflict, and whose forthcoming report to the General Assembly will deal precisely with this topic. As an elected member of the Security Council, and I can tell you that today is the anniversary to the day of our election to the Security Council, my country, Ireland, has made it our top priority to bring the women, peace and security agenda to absolutely every conversation on the Council, on every single file. This is first and foremost, of course, a matter of rights. It's our right to be at the table and participating in the decisions that shape our world. But it's also because we know that inclusive peace is peace that works. And when we talk about inclusive peace and inclusive peace building, we really need to have an expansive understanding of inclusion. We know that women and girls are not a monolithic group. It's almost absurd to have to say it, but not all women and girls want or need the same things. That's why we have invested, and those of us who are very invested in delivering on the Women, Peace and Security agenda need to constantly make sure that everything we do is informed by an appreciation of the diversity of women and girls. We need to take account of women with disabilities, and that's a key part of that. Women and girls with disabilities comprise 1/5 almost of all women and girls worldwide. As we'll hear today, the challenges they face in conflict settings are particularly acute, whether that's in accessing education, healthcare, humanitarian assistance, or even basic shelter and places of safety. They're also at risk of greater risk of sexual and gender-based violence. The barriers to their participation in peace building and humanitarian action loom even larger, compounded as they are by layers of discrimination and inequality. But even as we acknowledge the challenges, even the difficulties, and I don't for a moment suggest that we should minimize them, let's engage also today in a spirit of a discussion of hope for the possibility of change. Exclusion and inequality are not inevitable. These are social constructs that we have in our power to change if we can mobilize and work together. 20 years ago, Security Council Resolution 1325 changed the game for women and girls in conflict. 2 years ago, almost to the day, the Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2475 on persons with disabilities in armed conflict. Combined with the CRPD, we have at our disposal formidable tools to advance the participation, protection, and rights of women and girls with disabilities in armed conflict. So let's get to work. I want to thank you all for listening, and I really wish all of us a really excellent session this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And as a fellow Irish woman, thank you so much for the work that Ireland is doing around inclusion. We now move on to 2 videos we're sharing with you. The first features a lady called Veronica Ngum. Veronica is a disability and inclusive development professional from Cameroon. She works on GBV and inclusive development for people with disabilities, and specifically women and girls. Veronica is herself a woman with a disability, and she is the CEO at Community Association for Vulnerable People and the president of the Northwest Association of Women with Disabilities in Cameroon. Veronica advocates with humanitarian and developmental actors to put to practice gender and disability mainstream in all interventions, leaving no one behind. Veronica will tell us about the experiences of women and girls with disabilities during the crisis in Cameroon, and will provide concrete recommendations to ensure women with disabilities are at the forefront of providing humanitarian relief. Our second video features Abir Al-Harakli. Abir is a disability rights activist from Gaza, occupied Palestinian territory. She has a degree in journalism and works to ensure inclusion of people with disabilities in the community in Gaza. In 2019, together with other people with disabilities, she established a team of traditional Dabke dancers for people who use a wheelchair. In the video message today, Abir will share difficulties she encountered as a woman with a disability to flee to safety when her community came under attack. Abir will leave us with a message of what needs to be done to make sure people with disabilities can access adequate and accessible shelter. This video is in Arabic with English subtitles, and the text will be posted in chat box.
My name is Veronica Ngum Ndi. I am a woman with disability, the Chief Executive Officer for the Community Association for Vulnerable Persons, and the President for the Northwest Association for Women with Disability, Northwest Region of Cameroon. My work is focused on the rights of women with disabilities. Cameroon has been facing a humanitarian crisis since 2016, and women with disabilities and the old have faced various forms of challenges. One, they have faced the challenges of being abandoned in their homes when people are fleeing for safety, and some of them have been burnt. The old have been burnt in their houses. For example, a woman in 2019 in the Kwakwa village was an old woman was burned to death in her home because she was unable to flee. Women with a disability also have lost properties. They have lost their homes. Some have had their homes burnt down, and so many of them have lost their assistive devices like wheelchairs, crutches, and the white canes. They have also the experience of facing gender-based violence in their host communities due to their over-dependent on their host families. My personal experience is I was born with a clawfoot deformity that has had 3 corrective surgeries and requires that I have an adaptation on my shoe. So on my way to the rehabilitation center where I adapt my shoes, I was faced with a mixed uniform officer checkpoint where I was forced to jump over a rope and mocking me for the fact that I'm an English speaking Cameroonian. Women with disability have limited access to humanitarian aid because they don't have access to information, they don't have access to distribution venues. Humanitarian actors don't take into consideration the gender and disability specific needs of these women. My organization, the Northwest Association for Women with Disability, have assisted to an extent at this approximately about 300 women with disability and their families in the Northwest region, where they have supported them with food and non-food items, shelter needs, menstrual hygiene needs, dignity kits. This is with support from the Equality Fund Canada. My message to the UN is they should be able to support women with disability-led organizations to take lead in their own humanitarian intervention, for they really understand their needs and have the better way to meet the needs of women and girls with disability. I also expect the UN and other international bodies to simplify their reporting format, reduce the cumbersome eligibility criteria for call for proposals and funding applications, give local women led the opportunities to partner so that they can be able to take lead in their own interventions and generally meet the specific needs for women and girls with disabilities. Thank you. My name
أنا عبير الهرقلي، عمري 28 سنة، سكان حي الشجاعية، الحدود الشرقية لمدينة غزة. طبعا في كل عدوان إسرائيلي على قطاع غزة بتم نزوحي من المنزل أنا وعائلتي، كوني بأسكن في منطقة حدودية خطرة جدا في أوقات التصعيد. لما شفنا الخطر كتير زاد، فبابا حكى إنه لازم نطلع من البيت، لكن أنا كان في بالي إنه أنا كيف بدي أطلع، لأنه أهلي راح يتأخروا في نزوحهم، لأنه أنا بدي مساعدة. طلعت وطبعا تعثرت كتير بالرمل وغرزت ووقعت وحملوني وكذا. طبعا أنا على كرسي، عندي ست كبيرة عمرها 80 سنة، عندنا ما يقارب يمكن 15 طفل صغير، كله صار يصرخ وكله يجري. فأنا إجا في بالي التجارب السابقة، إنه أنا كتير أحيانا طلعوا وسابوني، مش إنه نسيوني، لكن كل واحد بيجري يلا نفسي في هذه اللحظات. قصف عنيف والقذائف بكل مكان، بيوت بتوقع، دخان في الشارع، يعني إشي مرعب، وصغار بتجري وشيوخ بتوقع. فأنا صرت أمشي، حجار على الأرض وإزاز ويعني أشياء مش حقدر أمشي بالكرسي. فأنا جازفت ومشيت عليها، خرب معايا الكرسي، عجلات الكرسي تبعتي فكوا وخربوا، فأنا وقعت بالكرسي. ما كانش معايا حدا صراحة في هذا الوقت، اجوا ناس ما بعرفهم شالوني أو ركزوا الكرسي. طب أنا مش قادرة أمشي، فيش عجلات، مش قادرة أمشي أكتر، ضلتني قاعدة عاجزة ما بعرف ايش بدي أعمل. في ناس خبروا أهلي اللي هم ورايا، قالوا لأخويا إنه أختك وقعت بالكرسي، فحملني وقال لي بده يسيب الكرسي بالشارع. فأنا قلت له لا، بدي أموت هنا وما بسيبه، لأنه حتى لو عطلان يعني نوعا ما حيسد حاجة، حتى لو عطلان بس أي حاجة تشيلني عن الأرض. وأخويا حملني والكرسي الثاني حمله شاب وطلعنا. فوصلنا نقطة التجمع، كانت الدنيا ليل، فعليا 50 نفر في مكان ضيق. قعدنا 10 أو 9 أيام بالضبط، مش 9 أيام أعتقد. طبعا ما في فراش، مكان مهجور، يعني نومي على الأرض سبب عندي تقرحات، وتقرحات كتير مشكلة كبيرة إذا مسكت في جسم شخص من ذوي الإعاقة ممكن تؤدي لوفاته. الحمام بدي أروحه ما كنت أعرف، يعني اي شاب بده يروح على الحمام كانوا يروحوا على الجامع اللي جنب البيت. النسوان عندنا تروح على الطابق الثاني او الثالث عند الناس اللي احنا عندهم يروحوا على الحمام، لكن انا بدي حدا يحملني برضه. وانا صرت اخجل احكي بدي اروح على الحمام، على قد ما بقى انا بسبب غلبة لاهلي. وبعدين لو حملني وطلع حعرضه للخطر، قديش كنت خايفة انا انه يصيب حدا اشي من تحت راسي من بسببي انا. كنت كتير خايفة. أنا بحكي باسمي وأنا بحكي باسم فئة ذوي الإعاقة كلهم، حتى الإعاقات الثانية السمعية والبصرية كان لهم معاناة مضاعفة كمان. رسالتي للمجتمع الدولي إنه أول شيء يوفرونا، يعملوا لنا خطة، يعني إنه نطلع إحنا في وقت الأزمات، في وقت الحروب، ويوفروا لنا أماكن موائمة إحنا وأهالينا إنه نطلع فيهم على أساس إحنا ما نعاني.
Thank you. Two powerful messages there, I think, from Veronica and Abir, and to thank them for their participation here today. Next, we are moving on to our panel discussion. And just to introduce our panelists today, we have Nujeen Mustafa. Nujeen is a Kurdish Syrian refugee and disability rights activist. At the age of 16, she fled the war in Syria and made the 3,500-mile journey from Syria to Germany in a steel wheelchair. She was listed as one of the BBC's 100 women in 2018, and in 2019 became the first person with a disability to brief the United Nations Security Council. Nujeen is the recipient of the Alison Deforge Award for Extraordinary Activism from Human Rights Watch. She has co-authored 2 books about her experiences. We also have April Pham, who is the Senior Gender Advisor and Head of Gender Unit at OCHA. Amina Chirimovic, sorry, Amina, I mispronounced your name, Chirimovic, Senior Researcher, Disability Rights Division, Human Rights Watch. Ahmed Ghanem, a Programme Specialist working on Disability Inclusive Humanitarian Action with UNICEF. And the panel discussion today will be moderated by Elham Yousefian, an advisor working on inclusive humanitarian action and disaster risk reduction with the International Disability Alliance. Over to you, Elham.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us today. For the next minutes, we are going to have a bit of conversation about inclusion of women with disabilities in protection of civilians in armed conflict, as well as peace processes. So I'm going to start with Nujeen. And Nujeen, thank you so much for joining us. You have been one of the key figures influencing adoption of the resolution. So I want to hear from you 2 years after the adoption of resolution. How do you feel about it? I mean, what was your anticipation when 2 years ago you heard about the adoption of the resolution? Do you think that that anticipation is really happened what you were imagining? If no, what were the challenges? If yes, how do you feel about it? And tell us, I want to hear you talking to us about your experience at that time and now.
So of course, thank you for having me. Just to say for the first day, but I think that when the resolution was adopted, I was of course elated. I thought that at least there is something that you know, that is commands of and demands of member states of the UN Security Council to work on that agenda and include the issue of the protection of the people with disabilities in armed conflict. Just for that issue to be on the radar was a huge achievement, because up until that point there has been a huge gap, and there's a huge issue of an invisibility of disability rights during armed conflict and in peace building. And now ever since then, of course, I think that there has been a lot of mainstreaming of disability rights issues in general, but I still don't see a practical impact of the adoption of the resolution on the it's not the desired rate if it's happening. And I think that there's still a lot that needs to be done for the protection of people with disabilities to be just as prominent on the agenda as let's say women and children's rights, or even the rights of the elderly. So I think that there has been a progress, but it's not, but it has not been enough.
Great, thank you so much. I really hope that events like this can contribute significantly in changing and making the current situation closer to what you were hoping for. So after the resolution, I have been personally, and I think many colleagues have been seeing you in many occasions. So you have been actively advocating for inclusion of women with disabilities in peace and security agenda. You have been participating. So we are emphasizing a lot on participation of women with disabilities in peace and security agenda. So I want to hear from you about your own experience and during these participations. How do you describe your experience, and what were the barriers that you faced as a woman with disability to participate in those processes?
I would say that I would say that I had it easy as a person. My disability is not visual or auditory. It's only physical, and I can express myself fully, without the need of assistance. But I've come across many instances where I had colleagues who were participating in these events and didn't have access because they had because there was no sign language interpretation, or it wasn't accessible for people with visual impairment. So there has been a lot of very ironic instances of events that are catered toward women with disabilities without them being accessible. And of course, that is very discouraging. But I think that, you know, I've also seen and witnessed a lot of activity on that front, and a lot of emergence of many wonderful, you know, women who are disability rights activists as well. And you know, and I think we have managed to prove and demonstrate that, you know, the input of women with disabilities is valuable to the peace and rebuilding process in every country, in every region. So that's that I think is a good, you know, good start. But you know, but as I said, it's still like, these are still, I would call them baby steps.
Yeah, baby steps, I agree. Thank you so much, Nurjeen. We will come back to you. I encourage our audience to post any questions you may have for Nurjeen and other panelists in the chat box. My colleague Sarah is monitoring the chat box, and we will hopefully have some time for questions and answers. Also, if you wish to take the floor and make your intervention yourself, just feel free to mention that in the chat box, and we will be happy to give you the floor in case we have time. So I want to turn to Emina. Emina, you have been working a lot on the ground, and one of the main essential things that we really need to ensure implementation of the resolution and inclusion of women with disabilities is data and evidence, and you're at the heart of that. You're working to provide data and evidence to us at global level, advocating, either we are the civil society or the UN. So my question to you is that, being on the ground for many years and in many countries, what are the three main violations that you would see women with disabilities are particularly facing on the ground? And what do you think we can do to improve the quantity and quality of data and evidence that we have on situation of women with disabilities, women and girls with disabilities, and of course, older women with disabilities on the ground? Floor is yours. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Alham. And I also just want to take this opportunity to thank the Mission of Ireland to the UN, the Mission of Mexico for organizing this event, and to all the co-sponsors. Elham, to answer your question, I think that Veronica and Nabir in the video messages already identified some of the risks and abuses, but I will just briefly sum up here. Women with disabilities are at higher risks during attacks because of difficulties in fleeing and finding an accessible shelter. When Human Rights Watch first met and interviewed Abir al-Harakli about her experience during the Israel military offensive in Gaza in 2014, Abir told her that she was unable to flee with the rest of her family when a missile struck her house. While trying to flee on her own, she was wounded in the leg and her mobility scooter was destroyed. She managed to flee to safety only when a male relative returned to help her. Together with Nurjeen, in Syria, we documented that a woman's ability to flee depended on whether she had a male relative to help her. In a society like Syria, a man with a disability will feel comfortable asking a male friend to help him flee. A woman will not. Next, in her video, Veronica spoke about women and girls with disabilities being at higher risks of gender-based violence, which, as she pointed out, is particularly increased during displacement. In February this year, I interviewed a single mother who currently lives in the Idlib district, Syria. She has 7 children, including a 12-year-old girl with a physical disability. She said she had no means to financially support herself or her children. And because of this, she had agreed, feeling that she had no other choice, but to marry 4 of her daughters at age to give them a way to be married. She told me she doesn't know what will happen to her daughter who has a physical disability. In 2017, while documenting sexual violence in Central African Republic, Human Rights Watch documented a case of a 22-year-old woman with intellectual disability who was raped by 2 armed fighters when her community came under attack. Women and girls with disabilities are also disproportionately impacted when having to flee their homes, losing usually the only accessible environment they had. When we spoke with Abir a few weeks ago about her experience during the most recent escalation in Gaza, she told us how she first resisted to flee her home because of the experience she had in 2014, when she spent 51 days living in an accessible shelter. She was placed by a humanitarian organization on a 3rd floor of a building with no elevator, no proper access to a bathroom, and no access to a wheelchair for 51 days. This is why she insisted so much on taking her broken wheelchair with her this time. Throughout our work on the situation of people with disabilities in non-conflict, we have documented that people with disabilities faced barriers accessing critical and crucial humanitarian assistance that other people did not, from using bathrooms to accessing food distributions. They also faced obstacles accessing healthcare, support services, and education. According to a report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Disability from 2017, lack of access to education disproportionately affects girls and young women with disabilities, especially those who are refugees, internally displaced, migrants, or asylum seekers. As to answer your second question, Elham, on how we can ensure experiences of women and girls with disabilities living in conflict zones are documented. First, all monitoring and reporting mechanisms should regularly and meaningfully include and consult women and girls with disabilities and their representative organizations. This applies to the UN monitoring mechanism as well as the work of the humanitarian and human rights organization. Throughout our work, including in my current research on the situation of children with disabilities in Syria, we come across international and local humanitarian organizations who view people with disabilities, including women and girls, through the so-called specialist lens. When we would inquire with mainstream humanitarian organizations about the experiences of persons with disabilities, they would often refer us to organizations providing disability-related services. There needs to be a shift from the assumptions that women and girls with disabilities need only disability-related services and that their experiences fall under only the disability umbrella. As an example of exclusion, and I'm actually very grateful that Ambassador earlier mentioned the Women, Peace and Security agenda, because what's been interesting is to see that only 2 of 10 UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security mention the needs of persons with disabilities explicitly, while not one include an explicit reference to women and girls with disabilities. This needs to change. All UN Security Council resolutions and reports related to conflict and post-conflict situations, including country resolutions, should include an age, gender, and disability analysis. When reporting, data should be disaggregated by age, gender, and disability. Currently, it's mostly disaggregated only by age and gender. Investigative bodies should prioritize, monitor, and fully investigate human rights abuses targeting women and girls with disabilities, including gender-based violence, and ensure that procedures are accessible to women and girls with diverse disabilities, including those with physical, intellectual, psychosocial, and sensory disabilities. I think I will stop here for now, Elham, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you actually answered the other question that I also had. So for now, let's go to our colleague, April from OCHA. April, thank you so much for joining us today. OCHA is key actor on the ground coordinating humanitarian assistance. So I want to hear you about from you about what have been done as far as you can share with us to ensure that specific rights and requirements of women with disabilities as a woman with disability is included and protected in provision of humanitarian assistance.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to join this conversation. And I was actually more excited to hear about the experiences of women living with disabilities as a way to inform my work and also OCHA's work. And I wanted to start the conversation by relaying a couple of stories. When I was working in the Ukraine and I talked to women, displaced women, older women, who were kind of stuck in these remote areas when fighting breaks out. And they didn't move because they said, listen, you know, we've outlived our husbands, we don't want to move. There's issues of insecurity, mobility, we want to stay. When I was working in South Sudan, and talking again to persons with disabilities, an older woman living with a wheelchair, and asking what her needs were. And she said, listen, you know, when I had to flee, I couldn't flee and I wanted to flee. But I was restricted, and my children, because of the insecurity due to fighting, took off and fled without me. And, you know, the guilt that they felt because of that, and the insecurity that she felt because she was kind of stuck behind, all of these emotions are felt by people living in displacement. Now, I share these stories just to really illustrate the importance of hearing the perspectives of persons with disabilities, and in particular, women with disabilities when we're working in displaced settings, in conflict settings, because they may have very different trauma, different experiences, and different ideas on, you know, how to best address their needs. When I was working in Darfur, talking to persons with disabilities and asking for what they needed, it wasn't food, it wasn't shelter. One person said, I just want a radio. I don't want your food. I just want a radio so that I can hear news about what's happening around me because I can't move. And so I really want to bring this point home around the need to talk to persons with disabilities from all different diversities, to make sure that we are inclusive of their needs when we do humanitarian response. Now on here, I want to return to the first point that Veronica from our women's organization in Cameroon, what she said really resonated, because she basically said, we need to be supporting women-led organizations to be at the table making decisions when it comes to planning, response to conflict, conflict prevention, humanitarian response, because they need to be at the table to help inform some of that thinking. And this is certainly one of the things that we are very much trying to do at OCHA. In our coordination role, in our humanitarian financing role, in our information management role, we are trying to amplify the voices and the experiences of women-led organizations and disability organizations to make sure that we understand their experiences, their capacities, their leadership, and to really promote that and fund that. And I'm very pleased to be in this event because it is one of the rare opportunities where we get to bring this intersectional lens to discussions around disability and gender. Often when we talk about persons with disabilities, there is also the danger of erasure of the gender perspective, the age perspective, because we only look at somebody's disability as being the issue that we need to focus on. And from my perspective, gender is the starting point, because we still live in a patriarchal world where women and girls are still disadvantaged and are still discriminated against because of their gender. Now, when you layer on top of that discrimination due to disability, that's, multitude of other barriers that women and girls have to experience in order to get assistance, and in particular in humanitarian settings. So I want to highlight a couple of things that colleagues, speakers have already said. Firstly, the need to support women and girls and their decision-making in humanitarian response and conflict prevention. And this is one of the key priorities, corporate priorities of OCHA. The second is around the data collection and the gender analysis. And certainly this is one of the things that we're really pushing for, this robust gender analysis from this intersectional lens, bringing in these other diversities that really compound a person's experience and the kind of needs that, the kind of response that is required. And then the third element, which we haven't really talked about, is around the experience of gender-based violence. We know that globally, 1 in 3 women experience gender-based violence. Women and girls with disabilities are 10 times more likely to experience gender-based violence. And this is one of the areas in which we must work more so to mitigate. So again, back to Veronica's ask that we support women's organizations. We are trying very much in our work in prioritizing gender-based violence or addressing gender-based violence to identify women's organizations, including disability organizations that work on gender equality, so that we can support them to have access to funding to do the critical work on the ground. I want to leave on a note to say, I don't want to sugarcoat and say that we're doing fantastic work. Absolutely, absolutely not. We're only starting to scratch the surface to really look at how we can better mainstream the issues for women and girls with disabilities. And I think it's great that it's getting such visibility and support from member states such as Ireland. But we need to do so much more to make sure that women and girls with disabilities are included in all aspects of conflict prevention, humanitarian response. I'll leave there for now.
Thank you so much, April. Very interesting and informative to listen to you. You highlighted a few very important points. One of them is the intersectionality and paying attention to that women with disabilities are a diverse group. You mentioned older women with disabilities. Another group is girls with disabilities, which perfectly connects us to our next panelist, Ahmed Ghanem, who joined us from UNICEF. Ahmed, please tell us about measures and plans in UNICEF to include children with disabilities affected by armed conflict, and specifically girls with disabilities. Welcome, and floor is yours.
Thank you, Ilham. Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to this wonderful event. I think first I will talk about the impact of armed conflict on children with disability and girls with disability. As we all know that armed conflict and the grave violation affected all the children directly or indirectly. Directly from the injuries itself, from the attack or fire or landmine explosion, that is actually exaggerated also by psychological trauma, depression that is coming from witnessing the traumatic events, as we have heard, and how this all event can lead to the psychological trauma and physical actually trauma. And indirectly, the armed conflict are affecting our social system that is existing on the land, and how the children, through this kind of breakdown of social services, breakdown of education services, food insecurity that could lead to malnutrition, losing home and house. So this is affecting actually all children. However, many children with disability will be more at risk for such consequences resulting from the conflict at different level. First of all, injury that's sustained by many children that is happening during the armed conflict, which may lead to long-term impairment, what could lead to acquired disability actually. Children with disability is among the most marginalized and at-risk population, starting off even before the conflict starting. And this is actually make them experience worsening of existing disability through decreasing and deterioration of infrastructure and reduce access to the services. Actually, all this level of interact together to cycle of violence that is the children with disability are caught of poverty, social polarization, increasing risk. And this is not only, and we are aware in UNICEF that it is not only affecting or creating new rate of grave violation. This is not only the problem. One big part of the problem that this is creating and increasing the barriers in front of children with disability, which lead to higher risk, and also reduce enablers. Community should have some sort of enablers to children with disability. And during the armed conflict, the community losing these enablers and such support and social services, access to assistive device, access to even social coherence and social support from the network, which actually reduce the resilience of the children with disability to deal with the conflict. And most importantly, also we have seen in different conflict zone that we have a reverse of previous progress that happened on inclusion and support services. And it's more difficult to gain the lost ground after the conflict. Even when the conflict is finished, usually we are unable to gain again what we have lost during the conflict from progression and inclusion. And I will highlight also what our colleague April have said in the situation of conflict and emergency, we have witnessed a lot that children with disabilities, especially girls, who are more likely than other children to experience discrimination, violence, due to intersectionality between age, disability, and gender. So they are interacted together and make girls with disability facing more difficulty to cope with this environment and more affected by distribution of social service and facing more additional barriers to access to protection and of course the humanitarian aid that is happening as we have heard from Veronica and Abir. And this is, for example, if I take the education, as Amina was talking about the education, we have seen that during education and specifically during armed conflict, we have seen that the barriers is increased, the availability of the services, education service itself is affected, the inaccessibility to existing services or accessibility to transportation, the education facility mostly that have been formed during the conflict is usually inaccessible and unwelcoming to children with disability. Stigma and bullying and insecurity all that lead to, for example, in 2018, we have a report from Syria saying that 4 out of 5 children with disability was living without having access to an education. So which is a huge number and actually alerting number. Again, girls with disability, as was discussing, is facing additional barriers and access to education, and also the stigma, safety concern, family choose not to send their kids to school because of this safety concern, lacking of wash services, as Abir was talking, inaccessibility and unsafe toilet and washrooms. All that is making temporary learning facilities sometimes, if not well designed, and considering the needs and participating and accountability to children with disabilities themselves, making them inaccessible to children with disability. But also, and most importantly, as we hear from the experience of Abir, that children with disability and girls with disability face increased isolation and discrimination in situation of armed conflict. The mobility difficulty, loss of assistive device, as Veronica was describing, difficulty for children to escape from dangers or flee, they may get left behind in some cases, as we have seen, and also the stigma and safety concern that led some family isolating and hiding their children at home. And of course, due to lack of data and lacking of outreach services, children with disability and girls with disability remain invisible in both need assessment and design. again, one of the most important issue is not understanding all this impact is very important, but also understanding that we will not be able to get the full picture without full participation of children with disability. And it's even more difficult than the participation of adults with disability. Children in general having a problem to participate, and the system that is created to invite them to participate and accountability for affected population is already have a limited impact on children. And you can imagine that this impact is actually with the intersectionality between disability, age, and gender, it's even more worse. In overall, I will talk also about how UNICEF is seeing that. I think that it's one of the main access point here is data, is a starting point. Understanding not only the quantitative one, because it's important, but it's not only the data that could be, we have to collect, and we are collecting a lot of qualitative data that is from children with disabilities themselves, from the group of persons with disability, as a starting point to understand the situation, to understand what is happening, but also to include a twin-track approach from designing the services to be first inclusive, all the services, as we have heard how the education, nutrition services, wash services should be accessible for everyone. And this is a very important starting point, but also having a specific design services in some cases and in some community to support specifically children with disability. All that without the support services that is linking this inclusion and specialized services in support services that allow participation, accountability, ability to access to inclusive services, it will be not as effective as we are expecting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. I really appreciate your intervention. I just want to ask my colleagues, Sarah and Kiva, to tell us about possible interventions from the floor.
Thanks, Elham. We have Joe Reid, who would like to ask a question from the floor. Joe, if you could just state your organization and who your question or comment is for.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, all. I'm Joe Reid with CARE, based in Washington, D.C. My question, if you'll permit me, is both for Veronica and for April. And I mean, thanks to all of the panelists for, I think, what was a really rich discussion. And I'm really pleased to see that we have lots of different types of accessibility in this session. It brings to mind how when, for the first time, we had a deaf woman briefing the UN Security Council earlier this year on the open debate on conflict-related sexual violence, accessibility was not provided to the extent that while she had an interpreter providing for herself, there was no interpretation provided at the actual event. So she wasn't able to have a dialogue with the UN Security Council members. And I think it's so important that we take the practice from events such as these and make sure that that this accessibility is available across all events, including when I think of the upcoming event on gender-based violence in emergencies that will take place next week during the ECOSOC Humanitarian Affairs segment. So I encourage us all to live up to what is being done so well in this event today. Veronica, thank you so much for the excellent comments that you were making. And I think we all agree that it's so important to hear from women and girls with disabilities working in emergencies like yourself. And it has been fantastic to see some progress being made in the regard of the voice and leadership of women and girls in emergencies being integrated into events, not only such as these, but I'm also thinking of events around the Global Humanitarian Overview launch last year, the Sahel Conference and others. But I'm wondering how far that's actually translating into the core support, the core funding of organizations that our fantastic speakers and panelists are from today. How much are these increased opportunities to speak at events like these coming with the core support that you need in order to be able to take up these opportunities, whilst also continuing the work that you do at country level. And to April, the side of this question is that I understand that the SURF underfunded allocation for this year is going to prioritize disability, which is absolutely fantastic. I'm wondering if you can tell us how organizations led by women with disabilities will be prioritized for funding within that funding stream. Thank you.
I will just briefly take the floor, Joy, to explain that Veronica is unfortunately not on the panel because of the bad internet connection, but she will be at another panel today at 1:15. If you can just send me your email, I'll send you details, and also happy to connect you to Veronica directly.
Thanks, Amina. And if any other panelists want to speak to that question of how far these opportunities come with actual core support being provided by institutional donors, always interested in answers to that question. And again, thank you.
Thanks, Joe, for the question, and great to always keep us accountable to the commitments that we make. And certainly, if I can just say from OCHA, we are very committed to the whole gender equality agenda. And in particular, the strategic steers that we have, and in particular for funding for pooled funds, includes disabilities and includes women and girls. So certainly for this year, when we prioritize underfunding, and in particular around disabilities, we will certainly ensure that women-led organizations will definitely be part of that conversation, and trying to make the funds available to to those organizations. Now, when it comes to GBV funding, we make a special effort to make sure that at least 30% of that funding is distributed to women-led organizations. But I shouldn't say but. And across all of our funding, we put in particular emphasis to all of the organizations applying to bring in that gender lens. So while we can't explicitly say how many women and girls organizations will be targeted for this underfunded round, it's certainly something that we are encouraging all of our UN partners to strengthen in terms of their strategies to make the funding more accessible. I think on Veronica's point, what struck me was she was basically saying, make your processes less cumbersome and less bureaucratic to make the funding more accessible to us, right? And that is something that we hear time and time again. And so on this, we are making efforts to make sure that our formats, our forms and processes aren't so cumbersome. But one of the other things we're trying to do, Joe, is to strengthen, to have capacity strengthening initiatives as part of all of these allocations to make sure that we're providing the support and the resources to organizations that are applying for the funds, to make sure they understand the guidance, to make sure they get the support that they need. But that's certainly not only at the OCHA end. I think that is a collective responsibility, of all of the organizations working, in humanitarian action to make that commitment to support local organizations, and in particular local-led women organizations and disability organizations, to apply for some of these funding. So, in a roundabout way, I haven't given you the answer, but I think there isn't a really easy answer in terms of, how do we support? Because I think that support to women-led organizations is not only about having the policy to prioritize them, which we do, but it's about also having the resources and the technical expertise to provide the capacity strengthening to women-led organizations in order for them to better engage. And that is something that we're working on, and I think that is something that we can't do on our own. And as you know, Joe, we You know, we have gender working groups within OCHA, what we call gender contact groups, where we're talking to gender experts, and we have a similar group that works, that talks on disability issues. And so we're, you know, talking to our experts in these areas in order to improve some of these funding processes to make them less cumbersome, as Veronica had asked for.
Thank you so much, April, for your intervention and answering that question. I have another question for you, Emina, if you don't mind. I want to ask you a little bit more about specific inclusion of women with disabilities in peace building and conflict prevention. And also, are we really using the opportunities of UN Security Council resolution, especially the 1325 resolution? So if you have some remarks on that, happy to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Alham. I was actually very pleased to also hear Ambassador earlier mentioning both the resolution that was adopted 20 years ago on women, peace and security, which actually affirmed that every peace process should include women and girls in the process itself. And also Ambassador mentioned earlier in her speech, the resolution 2475, which was adopted in 2019, which actually recognized the critical contributions that people with disabilities make and urged the states to ensure meaningful, full and effective participation of people with disabilities in conflict prevention and peace building. And the reason why I'm mentioning both of these resolutions is that something also that Najeen mentioned in her speech, when she said, but I haven't seen much being done practically. So even though the resolution on women and peace and security is 20 years old, there is currently no non-tracking of representation of women with disabilities in conflict prevention or peace negotiation. We often refer to Najeen, who is on the panel with us, as the first woman with a disability to brief the UN Security Council, which happened in April 2019. And since her, like two other women with disabilities, did brief the UN Security Council, as Joe mentioned, including during the most recent open debate on women, peace and security. But the current gap that we are seeing is actually implementation of these resolutions in country-specific contexts. So I'll just give two quick examples. So even though the resolution did call for meaningful participation of people with disabilities in peace-building contexts, the most recent resolution on Central African Republic, for example, there is a strong language which calls the MONUSCO, which is the UN peacekeeping operation there, to assist authorities to ensure increased participation of women, youth, faith-based organizations, refugees, and IDPs in the peace agreement. There is no mention of women with disabilities or any mention of ensuring accessibility, an issue that Najeen also spoke about in her remarks. Same with the resolution for the renewal of the UN peacekeeping operation in South Sudan, which actually did express serious concerns about the situation of people with disabilities in South Sudan. But there is no mention of this group when the said resolution calls for full, effective, and meaningful participation of women, youth, faith groups, and civil society in the peace process. There's no mention to ensure that these efforts should be accessible to people with diverse disabilities. So just maybe to also end on a few recommendations in this regard, and it is that all the UN Security Council resolutions and debates that discuss conflict prevention and peace should include a specific reference to the UN Security Council Resolution 2475 and call for full, effective, and meaningful participation of men, women, and children with disabilities. The upcoming armed conflict, the upcoming UN Security Council open debate on children in armed conflict that is happening on June 28th should make sure that the voices of children and girls with disabilities are included. So I would just quickly end here, Alham, as I know we are running out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ina. I again want to thank all our panelists who dedicated their time in such busy period to be with us, and thank you for joining us. I want to hand over back to you, Sarah, for the last section. We have 2 more exciting sections left before we close this event. Over to you.
Thank you, Alham, and thanks to our panelists for those rich contributions. So today, unfortunately, Professor Gerard Quinn, UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, could not join us here today. He has, however, kindly prepared a short video for the event.
Thank you so much for organizing this extremely important and timely side event. I'm extremely sorry that I cannot join you live today. I just want to make 3 observations. Excuse me. The first has to do with intersectionality. The second has to do with the relative invisibility of persons with disabilities, including specifically women and girls, in international humanitarian law. And the third has to do with the future. How can we roll back the effects of intersecting disadvantages and make women and girls with disabilities visible as well as valued? First, intersectionality. I promise not to wander off into a learned excursion. Suffice it to say that intersectional insights are relevant at 2 different levels today. First of all of our identities overlap and intersect. One can be Black, disabled, and a woman. Not any one, but all 3 together. Secondly, and much more to the point, each one of these labels can carry with it its own set of privileging. White over Black, able-bodied over disabled, men over women. The accumulated disadvantages are not just additive, they increase exponentially according as multiple disadvantage labels are applied. Probably the worst is to be considered invisible as a person, to have one's personhood denied, to squat anxiously at the edge of consideration, not to count as a person. Such certainly was, and still is to some extent, the case with women and girls with disabilities. Secondly, what about invisibility? Why is it so damaging? Why does it impact the human spirit in such a deadly way? Human societies have tended in the past to be constructed on the basis of who they include and also who they exclude. Even when not formally excluded, our societies have tended in the past to be made up of concentric circles of those most excluded and those relatively excluded. Interestingly, these circles of exclusion were reflected both in practice and in norms that supposedly provided universal rules. Take, for example, international humanitarian law. Certainly women and girls with disabilities were visible, but this was always a partial visibility, treated more as an object than as a subject. Third, what about the future? To me at least, the UN CRPD pressed a powerful reset button. Henceforth, the new default on disability was to be based on personhood, moral agency, a right to belong and participate, visibility. This reset goes to the heart of the CRPD. You might say these were the original values in the 1948 Universal Declaration, except they were far from universal in practice. This reset in the CRPD has vast ripple effects, and this is why we are here today. Whole fields of law and policy that either discounted the personhood of women and girls with disabilities or too quickly accepted their relative invisibility are now being closely interrogated as a result. There is no hierarchy of international treaties, and one cannot simply say that because the CRPD amounts to a reset of values that everything else should fall automatically into line. But one can certainly say that the fragmentation of international law is in no one's interests and that we should all strive for greater coherence in international law. To me, at least, this means finding creative ways of nudging international humanitarian law to be much more alive to the personhood, visibility, and equal rights of women and girls in the context of conflicts. Other cognate fields are also being impacted by the ripple effect of the CRPD: refugee law, humanitarian relief, and yes, peace building also. As the most active advocates, women and girls with disabilities have always had a lot to contribute to the process of peace building and moral repair in our societies. If you want proof, look to the sterling work of Monica Wilson of Disability Action in Belfast in the 1980s and the 1990s, always using disability to build bridges across sectarian divides, and in the process laying an important foundation stone for the peace process on our island. I'm convinced this has been replicated right around the world, especially in conflict zones as they try to imagine a better future. Women with girls with disabilities and girls with disabilities have always had vital insights into how to build a much more inclusive society based on mutual respect, a belief in our common humanity, and peace. In conclusion, I think our work has only really just begun. The ripple effects of the CRPD is being gradually felt in areas as diverse as international humanitarian law and indeed private international law. That's the thing about paradigm shifts. They make us see reality anew. They make us judge reality anew, and they compel us to seek greater harmony in diverse fields of international law. Everybody gains by this civilizing force, and not just women and girls with disabilities. The acclaimed UN Security Council resolution 2 years ago on disability and conflicts painted a bridge into the future. We now need to start populating that bridge and moving to the other side. Thanks to the Security Council resolution, we have the tools. Now we need to start using them. Thank you so much, and I wish you all the best with this side event.
Thank you to Professor Quinn for his contribution today. We're shortly coming to the end of this event, but before we do, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Alicia Buenrostro, Deputy Permanent Representative of Mexico to the UN, for the closing remarks. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. An amazing event, I can tell. And I would like to say, first of all, dear Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason, distinguished panelists, dear participants, it is an honor to participate in this side event alongside these great speakers on the occasion of the 14th Conference of State Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The Convention, one of the most widely ratified human rights treaty, recognizes the need for all persons, including women and girls with disabilities, to be guaranteed the full enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms without discrimination of any kind. Dear friends, we have heard this morning from very strong voices recognizing the ways in which women and girls with disabilities are disproportionately affected and face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and violence in situations of armed conflict. It is stressful enough to be in a situation dominated by uncertainty of whether you and your family will get to live another day. But women, older women, adolescents, and girls with disabilities are in a particular situation of vulnerability, facing social and systematic barriers, stigmatization, and lack of accessibility in their daily lives. When the provision of basic services is interrupted and infrastructure and social protection systems are weakened, women and girls with disabilities are the first ones to suffer the consequences, and unfortunately are most often being quite literally physically left behind. I would like to highlight Article 11 of the Convention, which was mentioned during today's event. We have an obligation, and this is an obligation, to take all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of women and girls with disabilities in situations of risk, armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and natural disasters. Moreover, Article 25 of the Convention recognizes the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health services without discrimination of any kind, including sexual and reproductive health services and mental health services and psychosocial support. In upholding our commitments, it is crucial to eliminate all barriers, including institutionalized settings, which represent one of the worst forms of segregation if we are to ensure the inclusion of persons with psychosocial disabilities in their communities. My dear friends, 2 years ago, the Security Council adopted unanimously Resolution 2475, its first ever resolution calling upon member states and parties to armed conflict to protect persons with disabilities in conflict situations and to ensure they have access to justice, basic services, and allow and facilitate safe, timely, and unimpeded humanitarian assistance. Regrettably, violence against women and girls continues to be the most widespread violation of human rights in the world. And despite the Secretary General's call for a ceasefire in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are failing as an international community to protect the rights of women and girls with disabilities in these situations. They are disproportionately impacted by armed conflict and humanitarian situations as they face greater risk of violence, abuse, neglect, or negligent treatment, maltreatment, or exploitation. Now is the time to end impunity for criminal acts against women and girls with disabilities and ensure they have access to justice, effective remedies, reparation, and psychosocial support, which is quite important, including through preventive actions that meet the specific needs of women with disabilities in emergency situations. Our obligations set out in the Convention demand us to ensure intersectoral approaches that are gender transformative, age-sensitive, and disability-inclusive in the implementation of all humanitarian response and peace-building efforts, as well as in all COVID-19 recovery plans. This in full partnership and with the participation of women and girls with disabilities and civil society organizations. Last year, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security, which is now more relevant than ever to ensure the full, equal, and meaningful participation of all women and girls in all their diversity, including women and girls with disabilities in all international peace and security matters. Women and girls with disabilities must be included in all decision-making and peace processes, and their social contributions must be recognized. We must ensure that as right holders and agents of change, their leadership, independence, and autonomy is fully recognized and supported. Finally, I would like to highlight the importance of strengthening data collection systems to better serve the needs and protect the rights of all women and girls with disabilities, taking into consideration their disability, age, geographic location, migration status, income, race, ethnicity, and other relevant characteristics. Gender-based violence often goes unreported, and data collection on persons with disabilities is very uneven, and it's quite important. We must strengthen our data collection systems to ensure that every woman and every girl with a girl with disabilities is visible and accounted for and receives the attention she needs for the full enjoyment of her human rights. Dear friends, in line with our feminist foreign policy, my country, Mexico, places human rights and gender equality at the center of all our foreign policy actions. Rest assured that you can count on Mexico as a strong partner and voice as we advance our collective efforts to place women and girls with disabilities at the center of the WPS agenda and the humanitarian action. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to continuing engaging with all of you in the promotion and protection of the girls of women and girls with disabilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. That brings today's event to a close. I'd like to thank the Missions Ireland and Mexico for co-hosting this great event, to thank all our contributors, our sign language interpreters and live caption providers, and all who have attended this event. Wishing you a pleasant day, afternoon, and evening. Goodbye.